And thank you for coming out today for what I think is a very important press conference. One of the keys to this press conference today is to identify some issues that have gone not just on in Griswold, but throughout the state of Connecticut. Let me start by introducing the sitting elected folks who are in the room. To my far right here is State Representative Mike France. Next to him is going to be State Senator Joe Markley, Senator Suzio, who is really going to bring things home with his statistics, who's been on top of this topic for many years, and Senator Heather Summers. The one thing we will not do is make this a political thing. There are some candidates in the room, and we appreciate your support coming out today, because this is how important the subject is. You know, the topic of what took place in Griswold in December of 2017 is something that I'm all too familiar with in my career. As a correction officer and someone who has dealt with criminals, not just in supervision, but also incarcerated, I know all too well of having a weak policy in regards to the criminal justice system. And particularly when we don't supervise our offenders correctly, we can find things like this happening. And I think that when Senator Suzio steps up to the mic, you're going to hear some statistics that should scare you. They scare me, someone who's been a professional who worked in the field for many years, 21, majority of my career supervising and ensuring inmates in that capacity stayed out successfully, and when they failed, we brought them back to jail. You know, it's interesting when you look at the Malloy administration over the last 8 years. It's my opinion, and I think it's the opinion of many, that the Malloy administration's had an agenda driven by national politics versus rather the reality of the world. You cannot have a second chance program that basically gives freedom to offenders to reoffend, and reoffend, but stay out and not pay the price. You know, what message are we sending to the offenders when they come in and have 7 or 8 dirty urines for heroin when we're fighting an epidemic in the state of Connecticut? You know, when you look at what happened in Griswold, we had an issue that started with a drug problem. The young man had been battling a heroin addiction. He cut a deal, as we know, for a swap for guns for drugs. He invited these animals down from Hartford to come down to his house to take the guns. And what he did is he introduced the devil into his house that night. And when he did this, he didn't realize himself, I'm sure, that he was going to have this actual particular crime take place. But what we know about the crime so far, and I want to give a real pat on the back to the Connecticut State Police, and particularly the Major Crime Unit in Southeastern Connecticut, who did a phenomenal job of investigating this crime. You know, we were worried we were never going to know what happened in Griswold. All the time, the Connecticut State Police, who are underfunded and undermanned, were out doing a phenomenal job, and they were able to put the piece of this puzzle together. And when you read the police reports and when you read the court reports, if you don't get a little knot in your stomach, then I just don't think you're human. These people were tortured. This is, I wouldn't compare apples to apples to the Cheshire incident, but this is as horrific as an incident that could take place in anybody's mind. This was a beating, a stabbing with hammers and brutal force that is just unheard of and unimaginable to me. But unfortunately, as we know yesterday, there was another arrest. And I believe there'll be more arrests as indicated. And the arrest yesterday of the brother, who was out on probation and serving his remainder of his sentence from attempted murder to right on down the laundry list of crimes he's committed in his short life. He was out free. He was in what we know is in violation status, as has been indicated. And the objective of today, folks, is we are going to go forward with an inquiry, not just into this individual, but into this system. We're going to demand that the Governor Malloy, we're going to demand that they probation and parole and corrections. And by the way, I've talked to most of the rank and file, but specifically talked to Commissioner Semple. I have a lot of respect for that man. I think he knows his job well, and I think he wants to do his job. I think this is bad policy under Governor Malloy with his second chance program, and particularly Mike Lawler. Folks, the state of Connecticut, take it to the bank. Mike Lawler has his fingerprints on each and every one of these crimes that takes place because it's been his agenda to push this forward. So I'm going to call him out. be quite honest, I'm not running for office again, so I don't really care. I care about living in a state where my wife and I, my children, your children can live safe. It's time to stop the nonsense. And so I'm a little passionate about here. I love the town of Griswold. I am so affected by this personally and emotionally in this community that I felt the need to bring these professionals together and make sure we make this an agenda item in this upcoming election, to make sure we don't put back the same people who made the mistake to approve the Second Chance program. We need to get back the death penalty. I'm sorry if I say that and upset you, but I believe it to be true. So I'm going to turn it over to Heather Summers, Senator Summers, who is going to make some comments, and then we'll go down over here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for coming. My name is Heather Summers, and I am the senator who represents the town of Griswold. I wanted to share with you something that I think is really important that we keep in perspective. This press conference is about law and order here in Connecticut, but we also can't lose sight that we have lost an entire family here in the town of Griswold. And I received a phone call today on my way here from somebody who is actually an elected official in Stonington who knew Mr. Lindquist personally. He went to Norwich Tech with him. And what he told me about him was that on the outside he might have been a little rough around the edges, but that he had one of the most solid moral compasses that he has ever known. He knew the difference between right and wrong. And this person, who is probably in their late 50s, has been shaken to the core over what has happened here in Griswold. And that's an elected official. So nearly 4 years ago, when I ran for lieutenant governor, I sent a letter to Governor Malloy, which I'm going to read from today. It says, Governor Malloy, the Risk Reduction Earned Credit Program, known as the Prisoner Early Release in Connecticut, constitutes an ongoing, pressing danger to Connecticut families and to our communities. The danger posed by this program cannot wait to be addressed in a new administration, and the public deserves immediate action and transparency from the current administration. The statistical likelihood that thousands of crimes may be violent are occurring on Connecticut streets and towns because of this program is undeniable. Further troubling are the proportion of the early release program beneficiaries who are deemed violent or serious criminals. Undersecretary Lawler has noted that over 50% of early release criminals are either violent offenders, meaning murder, sexual assault, armed robbery, or what is deemed as a serious offender. I won't read it all, but I thought I would highlight these portions. At that time, Connecticut residents had heard the anecdotal evidence of the failure of this program. The public had seen the coverage of Frankie the Razor Resto gunning down a person in Meriden in a convenience store in cold blood, and the murder of a 1-year-old child in Bristol by Arthur Hapgood. And at the end of the letter, I say, every day the early release program continues and Undersecretary Lawler remains in your administration. You disgrace the sacrifice and the service of our law enforcement and corrections officers who have risked their lives and well-being to bring violent and serious criminals to justice and keep them where they belong, behind bars. Every day the program continues, every community in Connecticut is subjected to the increased danger from dangerous, violent offenders. This is a matter of life and death that cannot wait for an administration's new leadership. That was 4 years ago. I could just send this letter again because nothing has changed. I wanted to talk to you today because here we are, we have a family that is completely annihilated except for one son, who's the one left behind, in a sleepy northeastern town here in Connecticut. It is clear that the judicial policies, ranging from the Department of Corrections to the way that we have our early release program set up and our Second Chance program here in Connecticut, have been an epic failure. We hear about crime reduction in Connecticut, but we don't know is exactly how the governor and his administrations are recording these crimes, because it appears that they are not recording those who are repeat offenders. We hear about second chances, but I asked Governor Malloy and Mr. Mike Lawler, what happens to delinquents' second chance? They don't get one because they're not taking another breath because of this program. I may not come from a law enforcement background, but I do understand law and order. I am a mother, a wife, a senator, and we have a duty to protect those that we serve. Just this year alone, think about some of the things we have heard about under this administration. We have had women giving birth in prisons by themselves in the solitary cell. We have had someone who was mentally disabled or impaired get in a car, drive through a hospital emergency room, and set themselves on fire. And now we have a family that has been completely and horrifically tortured in the sleepy town of Griswold, all under this governor's rule and administration. I want to thank all law enforcement for their dedication and for them putting their lives on the line to protect us every single day. I have spoken to many different law enforcement officers, both men and women, that are so discouraged by what they see in this administration. They risk their lives to put violent offenders behind bars, and either the judges let them go, or if they're a juvenile, it doesn't count anymore, and they come back and do it again until eventually, maybe someday it will count. And then we let them go. We let them out early for good behavior, whatever that means. You can't get a real good detailed accounting of did they pass the courses, what did they do, and then they're back out on the street. And here we have a man who had been a violent offender, first-degree assault, arson, first-degree larceny. Those are violent offense. Out from Hartford, coming to our sleepy town, murdering a family in cold blood. It is unacceptable, and I will not stop until it changes. Thank you for coming, and I would like to introduce now Senator Len Suzio.
Thank you, Senator Summers. The murder and mayhem committed here in Griswold a few months ago are the latest and graphic example of a notoriously failed law here in Connecticut. It's not only a failure, it's a betrayal by the Malloy administration of the people of Connecticut. Government's most important responsibility is to protect the citizens it serves. Tax breaks are wonderful, economic growth is desirable, but nothing is more important than your own personal safety. And if you have to worry every time you walk out your front door for your own life, then those other freedoms, those other aspects of life are meaningless. And the early release law, which was passed in June of 2011, literally at the stroke of midnight, I was there on the Senate floor when that bill was passed and debated. And I remember during the debate thinking, somebody is going to pay for this with their own life. I didn't realize at the time that only a few months later, one of the first murders committed by a so-called reformed prisoner who had graduated from the Risk Reduction Earned Credit Program would occur in Meriden, literally 4 blocks from where I live, where an innocent and elderly store owner, Ibrahim Gazelle, was murdered in cold blood by Frankie the Razor Resto, who had been let loose from prison early, courtesy of this notorious and failed early release program. I wish that that was the only example, and as I say, the murders that were committed here only a few months ago are just but the latest example of a law that has failed to protect Connecticut citizens over and over again. We've now had 6 years, and through the end of December, we had 6 years and 4 months worth of experience. And through the Freedom of Information Act, I have obtained data regarding that experience, which ought to scare the daylights out of anybody who knows what the details are. And I just want to share some of that information with you. First of all, during that period of time, just under 40,000 criminals were discharged from Connecticut prisons having received some risk reduction earned credits. They were let loose from prison early. In the first year's group of prisoners, there were 8,727 discharges, and in the following years, 8,351 of those discharged prisoners were readmitted. That's a 96% rate of recidivism, ladies and gentlemen. It's not even close to being successful. We're talking, too, by the way, about serious crimes. I identified over 12,700 crimes, 12,705 specifically, that I consider to be serious and violent in nature that have been committed by prisoners who have participated in the risk reduction credit program, but who were, upon release to the community, turned out to not be a risk reduction. It was a risk exaggeration program is what it is more than anything else. And so I'll share some of those numbers with you, which are, I believe, incredibly shocking. First of all, with respect to murder, homicide, and acts of manslaughter, this is through December of last year, and it would not count the homicides that we're talking about today because they weren't part of the official statistics at that point in time. 119 murders, homicides, or acts of manslaughter were committed by prisoners released from our prisons early, having been rehabilitated, in quotes. In terms of sexual assault, 154 sexual assaults. Now, if you add that together, those two numbers together, you come up with about 270 some odd murders or sexual assaults, and that's over 2,200 days experience. So it comes out to basically an assault, a sexual assault or murder, roughly every 8.1 days, committed by an early release prisoner who had been discharged from prison, having been, quote, reformed. I identified of the 12,705 violent crimes, we're talking about 1,916 assaults. We're talking about 1,200 violations of protective or restraining orders. We're talking about 1,539 drug dealers who've been readmitted to prison, having been actively engaged in the act of selling drugs. We're talking about 1,988 acts of burglary or robbery, sex crimes against children, 603, strangulation, 263 acts of strangulation. If you take these 12,705 serious and violent crimes, and again, you look at it in terms of the 2,200 and odd days that the program has been in effect, it comes out to 5.7 violent crimes per day being committed by supposedly reformed prisoners who had been let loose from our prisons early because they participated in this risk reduction program. The program is an abject failure. It's a joke in the prison system. I've received letters from inmates who have confided to me how the system is gamed. We learned that some of the courses that the prisoners take are the history of the Philippines. That's one of the courses that qualified for early release credits. We're not talking about serious courses to reform criminal behavior. It's an excuse to lower the prison population, save the state money, but cost our citizens their lives and their well-being. It's a law that should be terminated as soon as possible insofar as violent offenders are concerned. I have no problem with continuing the law insofar as nonviolent offenders are concerned, but when it comes to violent offenders, do the crime, you serve the time. And you know what? Our criminal justice system is about three things. It's about protecting the public, number one. It's about justice, number two. And lastly, it is about if we can rehab the prisoners or the criminals, that's great. That's a third objective. But the first two are preeminent. We've got to protect the public, and there has to be some act or sense of justice, otherwise we all lose respect for the law. There is no second chance for the victims of the crimes. In fact, all too often, the criminal is out of jail before the victim is out of the hospital. So I call upon the governor to suspend the notorious early release law. We now have had 6 years and 4 months worth of failure. There's plenty of data to show it's not working, and in fact, it's risking the lives and well-being of our citizens, and that's attested to by the thousands of crimes that have been committed by these rehabilitated prisoners who are resuming their life of violent crime. And we call upon the governor to suspend the program. If we're going to have a special session of the legislature, in my opinion, that should be one of the top items on the agenda, that we should have a revisiting of the early release program, and we should seriously talk about rescinding the program or seriously modifying it so people who commit violent crimes are not eligible for early release. And I would be happy to share with you any more information that I have. I have millions of records, literally. The DOC downloaded to me all their electronic files. That's how I know these statistics are real. I know that the criminal who's been charged with the murders in this particular crime, he was freed on September 8th of last year, having received 364 days of early release credits. So he was out of jail at least a year earlier than he should have been had he not received the risk reduction credits, and the family would very well be alive today if he were behind bars where he should have been. But again, I'd be happy to share with you and answer any questions regarding the statistics. Every 6 months, I get an update from the Department of Correction. So at the end of June, I expect to get the latest update. The numbers I'm sharing with you were from September of 2011 through December of 2017. And I think it's important for the public to know what an incredible failure and what an incredible betrayal that law is. Thank you very much.